CFL 110, your weekly trip around the biggest stories in the Canadian Football League with Jeff Hamilton and Andrew Hustler Paterson. Presented by Garage Living Winnipeg.
Turn the camera on. Hey, what's up, everyone? Welcome to another edition of CFL 110 here on Winnipeg Sports Talk. Andrew Paterson, Jeff Hamilton with you. And we're down to the short strokes of the regular season, folks. The playoff picture finally becoming a little clearer in both the East and the West. We'll be all over it coming up for the next 45 or an hour here on WST. Great to see so many of you with us live on YouTube. Tell a friend that loves the Canadian Football League about what we've got going on here and how they can find it. And if you are finding us on YouTube, don't forget the audio is available in podcast form wherever you get your favorite podcast. Just search CFL 110 and subscribe. CFL 110 is, of course, brought to you by our great sponsors at Garage Living Winnipeg. And with the fall here, the push is on to convert and change garages before the snow flies. And if you're interested in doing that, give Garage Living Winnipeg a call at 999-1234. Our pal Pat's been busy lately because as soon as back to school hit, people are suddenly seeing all the kids' bikes, hockey equipment, football equipment, you name it, strewn all over the garage. Garage Living has an innovative solution called Slat Wall. Dozens of hooks, baskets, and shelves that clip into it to get everything off your floor. There's even a cool golf club caddy and tire racks to store those winter or summer tires. And the cool thing is you can do as much or as little of it as you want to fit within your budget. This is your chance to clear the clutter, revolutionize your garage space, and organize and beautify it with Slat Wall, as well as polyaspartic floor coatings and made in Canada premium metal cabinetry for a total garage makeover. Check out their amazing work and what they've done for others at garageliving.com, and give Pat Kanuga a call at 204-999-1234 to book a free in-garage consultation or make an appointment to meet him in their showroom at 981 Main Street. Garage Living Winnipeg. Garages made for living. The Hammer, Jeff Hamilton of the Winnipeg Free Press, joins us now. What's going on, dude? We're getting down, as I said, to the short strokes, and things are becoming a little clearer in the CFL as we get closer to next month in Vancouver for the big prize.
And yet still muddy as all hell, Huss. Like, it's still, I think at the end of this weekend, that's why I opened up my my weekly CFL rundown column for the Winnipeg Free Press. I don't usually touch in the future. I usually talk mostly about what's happened, not what's going to happen. But this weekend slate is just too appetizing. That being said, lots of great games this past weekend. Some movement in the standings, still some very much potential movement in the standings. But I'm doing well, feeling good. Finally got the haircut. Finally got into the same country as my hairstylist together at the same time to get a couple inches lowered. So feeling good, ready to attack this CFL 110 show and get it going, man. Let's do this.
Well, I mean, I think we almost owe it to the Bombers to start right there. Another big win against the previously hottest team in the league. I mean, we've talked a lot about the Hamilton Tiger Cats this month on how they hung in, how well they were playing. And we knew the historic significance of just how difficult it was for the Bombers to win in Hamilton in the regular season. The Bombers continued their winning ways, running away with the 31-10 last week against the Ticats to come within one win or a Saskatchewan loss of clinching the West. This has been a turnaround unlike any I can remember in the last decade. I mean, I guess we could compare the 2011 Lions, who started off 0-5 and ended up winning the Grey Cup, but I don't believe that they made it through winning the West and having a home playoff game, and the Bombers are on the verge of doing just that. We can talk about how close the margins of defeat were early on, the self-inflicted penalties. The bottom line is that Mike O'Shea and this football team have not only cleaned up their act, but seemingly are peaking right now at the most important of the time of the season, heading into the playoffs, and have 8 consecutive wins to show against some of the best teams in the league heading into this weekend.
Yeah, I'll tack right off your first point. I mean, I was in Hamilton last week when we did our show, heading into that game Friday night. Again, another hot team, the hottest team in the CFL, many were saying, after 4 straight victories for Hamilton, still a chance at the playoffs. We'll get into them a little bit later. But here we are, deja vu, as was the case with Edmonton a few weeks before that, and back-to-back victories for the Blue and Gold, extinguished their playoff hopes, which are now gone. The Elks that being, and then the Ticats, same story. It's just not good news for the rest of the league, Huss. This team, as you mentioned, is finding the right gears at the right time. They're taking their game to seemingly a new level each week. Even if you look at the last 2 weeks here, the Bombers are finding different ways to win. Obviously, 2 weeks ago against Edmonton, it was the air attack and Zach Collaros throwing for a career-high 6 touchdown passes and eclipsing 400 passing yards. This time it was Brady ball, bully ball, as they like to call it, with Brady Oliveira taking over 147 yards and 24 rushes. That is where teams make hay at this time of the season, Huss, is the ground attack. We say it year after year after year. If you do not have a run game, when the weather gets colder, you will be in tough to win at this time of the season and into the playoffs when football matters the most. And the Bombers are just clicking in every capacity. And we haven't even mentioned their defense. Their defense is, under first-year defensive coordinator Jordan Younger, they're just so good. I don't know how else you can explain it. They are takeaway machines. I wrote in my story yesterday, about the Bombers, almost 2 different seasons. Game 1 to 8, when they were 2-6, it just happened to coincide. That end of that 8-game run coincides with, was a game against the Argos, who happened to be their opponent this week. And if they win this week, they can punch their ticket to the West. But my whole point in bringing that up was the first 8 games, the Bombers were one of the worst teams when it came to ball security. They were losing the ball at an incredible rate, whether it was Zach Collaros throwing interceptions, whether it was leading the league in fumbles. That game against Toronto was probably the, rock bottom part, where they lost the ball 5 times, including 3 lost fumbles in a narrow 2-point overtime loss to the Argos. Fast forward to the last 8 games, and they're leading the league. Nobody has more, no one has thrown fewer interceptions, given up the ball less in fumbles, and overall turnovers than the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. And that, to me, is a big part of their 8-game win streak, and a big part of playing responsible, clean football, which when you attach the running game, I just don't see anybody, including the Montreal Alouettes, which I know is a little bit disrespectful here because they do have the lone win against Winnipeg. Mind you, that was in week 1, and they are the reigning Grey Cup champions, but there's absolutely no arguing at this stage that the Winnipeg Blue Bombers are the hottest team in the league, and I think they should be putting the fear into all other teams that are making the playoffs. The Grey Cup runs through Winnipeg. That's the feeling you get right now, and I think that's the feeling we'll get in a few weeks when we figure it all out.
Early on in the season, both here and certainly on Winnipeg Sports Talk, the question was, well, wait a second, who is this team? I mean, so many the same players were back. So many of those same players were making uncharacteristic mistakes that we frankly had not seen in a number of seasons. And I will give Mike O'Shea a lot of credit. And O'Shea does things his way. He has immense confidence in the players that he has in his locker room. And, we heard him saying, well, what are you doing about all these turnovers? Well, we're working on it. We were talking about it every day. We're working on it in practice. And they are of the belief that if you practice a certain way and you focus on things, you will accomplish them. And to their credit, they have done exactly that. The turnaround when it comes to ball security, and when it comes to the taking care of the football, never mind the way the defense has stepped up, has been a huge, huge part of it. But the defense, to me, was where this turnaround started in the first place. The offense did not just flick the switch. It was gradual, to the point where we've now seen 2 of the best performances offensively of the year in the last 2 games, as the Bombers have really sort of been heating up. But I think about the job, and I joke that Jordan Younger is definitely the best dressed coach in the CFL. I don't think there's a DC that's done a job close to what he's done this year, because the Bomber defense resuscitated this season, and now the offense has got to a point where we have come to expect them in previous years. You put all that together, and that is a very, very scary team for the rest of the league come November.
It's a great point, Huss, and I'll add just one more to it. It's another scary thing about this team is all the adversity, particularly the injuries that this team faced early in the season, is paying back dividends right now. And you can just look to the Hamilton game, losing 3 defensive players, and Michael Ayers, Griffin, and Brandon Alexander, and having Jordan Younger. And Mike O'Shea made a note of this after the game when I asked him about it. You could hear Jordan Younger thinking out loud on the, over the speakers, trying to figure out all the different situations that they would be in. And not only were they able to recover, they blanked the Hamilton Tiger-Cats. The one last thing I'll take away from that game too is this is a prime example of what you cannot do if you are going to beat the Winnipeg Blue Bombers at this stage of the season and into the playoffs. You have to make every situation count. I'm not saying you need to be perfect. I'm not saying you need to be playing complete mistake-free football, but the Hamilton Tiger-Cats dropped what were 2 clear interceptions, and Tim White dropped another, potential touchdown, which could have changed the result of the game potentially, certainly the momentum and stretches in that game. And that is a warning to the rest of the league that if you're going to play the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, you have to take full advantage of the opportunities that don't come, or you're going to lose badly.
Moving on from the Bombers, and certainly we'll be talking lots about the Bombers as they move in. I mean, by the way, shout out to Blue Bomber fans. Another sold-out game this Friday. Unfortunately for Winnipeg fans going head-to-head with the Jets home opener, which doesn't help anybody. I'll just say that as a fan of both teams and someone that goes to both games. It is brutal that fans are going to have to choose. It is what it is. The Bombers do have the opportunity to clinch that game November 9th for the West Final in Winnipeg. There's also a game that day. We have seen in the past that be moved. Fingers crossed fans won't be put in the same situation, assuming the Bombers do get that done. But that team the Bombers swept at Labor Day in the Banjo Bowl has gotten off the mat. The Saskatchewan Roughriders will be in the playoffs this year, and they can book a home game in the West Semi if they beat the BC Lions in certainly a game that has the most implications for both teams. I would argue that the BC is a far more dangerous team playing on the fast track with that offense at home than traveling outdoors on the prairies to take on a team like the Saskatchewan Roughriders. It is unlikely the Riders catch the Bombers. Bombers would have to lose out, and the Riders would have to win out for the West Final to be in Saskatchewan. But looking around the West right now, before we even talk about Montreal and what happens in the East, because as we saw last year, crazy things can happen in the playoffs. I really sort of do thinking that assuming that this West Final is going to be in Winnipeg, that the Riders are the biggest test and the biggest challenge to Winnipeg in that West. And they could certainly help themselves out big time by getting that win at home and setting up a rematch between these two teams this week in Regina in November.
Yeah, I don't know how you can look at the West and not see the Rough Riders as the Bombers' biggest obstacle. And I mean, I want to say no disrespect to the BC Lions, but kind of disrespectfully to the BC Lions, particularly their lack of defense. That's a big reason why you look at the Rough Riders as a number one obstacle. You mentioned, Huss, yes, the Rough Riders got things started in the right way in a 19-9 victory to start the season in their first of 3 games this year. But even Winnipeg sweep, which is a very difficult thing to do. So credit to the Bombers for doing that. And what was an incredibly important time for them in marching back to the top of the West. So credit for them to win both of those games. But neither of those games were all that convincing in victories, right? I mean, was it 2 points in the Labor Day Classic?
They were great games, and they were really close.
Great games, and we know what happens when these two teams get together. Something wild happens. Like there's a crazy return touchdown at the worst possible time. There's blocked punts. There's just there's just so much.
There's controversy.
There's controversy.
Injured quarterbacks.
Exactly. All of those things. Now, the Rough Riders, why I think they're particularly dangerous is the same points I made earlier about the Bombers. The Rough Riders, now they haven't had AJ Ouellette for a good chunk of the season here, but he's back practicing and will be returning for this important stretch. I'm not saying it's great to have your running back come back from a weeks long injury, but it might be the best thing for AJ Ouellette, because I don't think if he played week in and week out to this point that he'd even be available. So that is a really good news for him. And if they can get anything like the AJ Ouellette back into the mix, I think that will give their running game an incredible boost. You have Trevor Harris, who is experienced, who has been playing well. You certainly can't look at him as a guy that's hurting the Riders so long as he can stay healthy. They have a consistent and good leader, behind center. Their receivers are making plays. I mean, you just have to look at that last week's game down the stretch to see and really all season, guys making big plays, whether it's Keon Schaefer-Baker, and who am I? Keyshawn Johnson, another guy who just said, "Get out of the way, give me that ball," and what was a deciding touchdown in that game. And it sucks that Sean Bain won't be in the mix anymore. He's out for the season. He was having a terrific year, but I do think this team has the weapons. And when you go on the other side of the ball, we'll talk about Roland Milligan, when we talk about the MLP race here, but this is a team that is very good against the run. They don't lead the league in run defense. That belongs to the Toronto Argonauts. That's Winnipeg's opponent this week. So Brady Oliveira is going to have another big game. It's going to be against a great run defense. But moving back to the Riders, they're second in the league, and they're not deep second. They're not a distant second. They're right behind the Argos in run defense, and they're also a battle-tested team in the outdoor weather. So that is all. Mix all those things together, and add to the fact that they have a healthy hatred for the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, and absolutely the Rough Riders can make some hay. The only thing that will hold them back, in my opinion, is the penalties. The plays. Deontay Williams, we talked about that suplex last week. He got suspended for a game for that. So that's going those things hurt your defense. Those things hurt your team, and this is a team that leads the league in unnecessary roughness penalties. Those are drive extenders. Those kill you in games. So, if Corey Mace can get his team a bit more disciplined here, he's got a lot of things going for him, and the Riders have a lot of things going for them, and they will be a dangerous group. I think with 3 straight victories heading into a great time of the year.
Well, we'll get more into kind of the middle of the divisions in a minute, but let's get to teams that will not be participating in the Grey Cup playoffs. Calgary and Edmonton. I believe this is the first time since the 40s that neither team would be participating in the playoffs. They got there in sort of different ways. It's been a slow erosion for Calgary since being, a consistent threat in the West. And they had a half-decent start and have really faded in the second half. And you've seen a frustration throughout the lineup, but especially with Coach Dave Dickinson. Meanwhile, the Elks had that brutal start, which was just a continuation of the most embarrassing period in the history of the franchise, to a big turnaround. Unfortunately, they dug themselves too big of a hole, and with those losses to Winnipeg, found themselves basically eliminated. Just thoughts on the absence of both of those teams, Jeff, and the massive offseason changes that are potential in both northern and southern Alberta.
Yeah, well, you say the 40s, and you're right. But the CFL wasn't even established till the 1950s. It's never happened in CFL history. I mean,
we often, like a rugby league.
We often hear about this long 100-year history. That's the history of the Grey Cup. So this has never happened in the Canadian Football League, which I believe began in 1958, if I'm not correct there. But it's just to me, it's obviously wild. I mean, it's never happened before. Whether that's we've seen the Elks not live up to their end of the deal of making the playoffs the last couple of years, but that hasn't been a thing in Calgary. This will be the first time, I believe, in 20 years, dating back to 2004, that the Stampeders won't be in the playoffs. The first time, certainly, since Craig Dickinson has been the head coach of the team. And so, I mean, mind you, last year Calgary finished 6-12, and if it wasn't for an absolute free fall by the Riders, who didn't win a game after Labor Day, chances are that streak is ending last season, and we're having this conversation last year. But there are issues. As for moving forward, as both teams look ahead to next season, I don't know who's in a better situation, to be honest with you. Both have a lot of work to get done. You look over in Calgary, and we talked about this. Is Dave Dickinson the right guy to be general manager and head coach? We are talking about major issues in the locker room in Calgary. We're talking about veteran players singling out the younger generation. That is not a good recipe for a room. And when you're the GM and head coach, who do you look at to blame? You have to look inside and figure out what you're doing wrong. So I would not be surprised at all if we saw Dave Dickinson, the GM, fire Dave Dickinson, the head coach, because I just don't think you can do it the other way. That will allow Dave Dickinson to focus on the players he brings in, and maybe a Mark Killam gets promoted to head coach. We've heard, less so, I'd say, over the last maybe year and a bit, but for years we heard that Mark Killam was the next, coach in waiting in the CFL. So, I think what saves Dave Dickinson ultimately is an ownership group in Calgary that I'm not going to say isn't committed. I don't think it's fair to say anybody who's been putting up the money for a CFL team for as long as, that Calgary Sports Group has been. I just don't think they're all invested in it. So I don't think that, and I think that actually works in Dave Dickinson's favor. Like, I don't think there will be a lot of motivation, given John Hufnagel just exited that organization on a full-time basis, to just completely wipe the slate. So I do think that Dave Dickinson's going to be back, but he's got to figure out in a big way how this organization is going to look and what team and what attitude and what players and character he wants in the room. Moving over to Edmonton, Larry Thompson, he's the owner, obviously, most recently taken over this Elks organization, turning them into a private group. He is going to have to find first, and it's coming, we've already heard reports of a president to take over the Elks, because Larry Thompson, while he's been a rabid Edmonton fan for decades, dating back to the 60s or 70s when he attended his first game, might even been before that, he is not necessarily a football decision maker, and he needs to put a president in place who has experience and can bring, that experience to that role and decide what the future is. And that president needs to sit down. We talked about this last week when I suggested that you need to clean house. You need to get rid of that Chris Jones stink. If you are going to hold on to it, if you think what you've seen over the last 6 weeks, despite the 2 losses back-to-back, if you like what you saw in the wins before that, and you believe there's something there, then you have to sit down with G. Roy Simon, GM, with the coaching staff, Jarius Jackson, the interim head coach, and find out if these guys have a better plan for the future. Because if they don't knock you off your feet and impress you, you got to get rid of them and bring in a GM who can then bring in a head coach, and that's a lot of work. And I imagine that decision needs to be made. If it's not being thought about right now, they're in trouble. It needs to be made, by the end of the regular season, and so you can start looking towards the future, especially if you need to bring in, different people. So, I think both have, full plates here. Both have reasons to be happy and not so happy, but I don't see either as being all that breezy. And I do think that we are going to likely talking about this next season. I don't see the Elks, coming in and dominating. I don't see the Stamps either. But I think the big question too, Huss, and I'll throw this to you, is you need to figure out what the situation with Trey Ford is in Edmonton. You need to make a decision whether he is your future or not. And if you might not think you have the time, then you need to move on from him, because somebody else will sign him. You can't bring him back as another QB in waiting. So I think that's the biggest question in Edmonton right now.
Yeah, Trey Ford's fascinating. I do wonder what sort of options will be available to him. Like, I'll be honest, I'm not sold on him being a starting quarterback that can go and win you a Grey Cup. Can a guy win some games? Can he play? Is he fun to watch? Absolutely. But I do think the jury is still out on that. And, listen, depending on who you listen to in Edmonton, I think there is some questions about, the buy-in to the team, the leadership that he had. And that's also very, very important. To me, next year for Edmonton is so important that I'm not sure they can go into the year with a maybe. I
agree with you.
I wouldn't be surprised if Vernon Adams is the quarterback of the Edmonton Elks next year. There's also some other really intriguing quarterbacks, and, we'll have some time to talk about this in the offseason, but Trevor Harris isn't signed next year. I think he's been brilliant this year for Saskatchewan for the most part. Davis Alexander. Now, again, in the Elks situation, as high as you might be on the guy from 3 or 4 games, with what's at stake for them, do you hand him the keys?
No, not with Trey Ford there, unless you're really not happy with Trey Ford. And I'll add this to the conversation, Huss. You talked about weeks ago about Trey Ford turning down, short yardage packages. I don't mind that. I imagine if you're a teammate, you don't love that willingness to do anything.
If you're a coach, you sure don't.
You don't, for sure, if you're Chris Jones, and really doesn't matter what Chris Jones thinks anymore out there, but certainly he didn't like it. The thing that I'm hearing, the big knock that I'm hearing about Trey Ford is that he just doesn't command a huddle. Like, he doesn't go into a huddle and exude this confidence, with the play. He goes through his play, he puts it, they break, and there's not a lot of conversation happening post-break of the huddle. He's not telling his receivers. He's not saying things like you would see a Bo Levi Mitchell or a Zach Collaros. And I think he's not doing that because he's learning how to be a stereotypical quarterback in the league. And I don't know if that's going to work out for him, if there's going to be enough time for someone to wait and to lose games while Trey Ford turns into a quarterback that he's arguably never been before. Look at his stats here. He doesn't even run like he used to. When he played the Bombers in that critical game, returning from injury, he ran twice for 9 yards. He tried to be a pocket passer, and it didn't work.
Well, I think the Bombers, credit to the Bombers for the way that Jordan Younger set up the defense, but I think they said, you know what? We are not letting you run. You have to beat us with the pass, and it didn't happen.
That's what every team's doing. That's my point, and he's not even testing them with the run. He's that gifted to make someone miss. I'm not convinced that you can just spy Trey Ford and he's going to be, gravy. We've seen this guy maneuver his way out of most impossible situations and then dial up a long bomb downfield. I'm not saying that's going to make coaches any happier or any more convinced to have him beside there, but he needs to figure out in these next games, and Trey Ford, I imagine, will be starting the rest here. We need to see a mixture of both. We need to see a guy confident in the huddle who can step in and throw those passes, but we also need to see what makes Trey Ford such a dynamic athlete. We need to see that added element of the run game involved there. We have to see that. Otherwise, I wouldn't. If I'm a head coach, I'm not banking on Trey Ford being a pocket passer and expecting my team to win the Grey Cup. And that's the rock in the hard place that the Elks organizations find themselves.
He is 100% the athlete. The quarterback is also in a lot of ways the CEO of the players, and
totally.
I'm not saying that he can't be there, and maybe he's that guy next year. It often does take quarterbacks time to become that guy. And listen, to his defense, he's been in the middle of the biggest mess in the league since he got here.
He's also got the most wins of an Edmonton quarterback in years since he's been drafted. So
now, that being said, that's
not a lot of wins.
That's not a hard number to achieve. And just one quick thing on Dickinson before we move on. I will say this: I've never seen him look as frustrated as he's been before, and I'm very interested to hear from Dave at the end of their final game and when they wrap up the season, to hear from him as to what his thoughts are on his own role moving forward, because he's a huge part of Stamp's history. He is the guy that's directing this organization right now. I couldn't help but think that maybe, he's not as much having second thoughts, but wondering about what the best path forward is, not only for the team and the organization, but also for him. Let's move on to Ottawa. And listen, Ottawa had that great record early on in the year. They were 8-3-1 at a certain time. They're now 8-6-1. To me, this is a bit of a market correction. I didn't think that they were ever as good as maybe their record was early on, but I also think that they've been underachieving as of late, Jeff. They're in a dogfight right now with the Argos. They've got they're up on them by a half game on account of a tie right now. What do you make of the Redblacks right now, as we've kind of seen the ups and downs, and there's been more downs than ups as of late for the team in the nation's capital?
Yeah, there's always a myriad of things why a team isn't performing on a week-to-week basis, but I do think you can identify three things pretty clearly with this Redblacks team. Obviously, quarterback play is an issue here. We haven't, Drew Brown has faced injury issues. He hasn't, been available. Jeremiah Masoli, while again, great story, came in last week, and I don't think did anything to suggest that the Redblacks could win, key important games with him behind center. Certainly, Drew Brown brings that element, that escapability, playing mostly clean football. I know it's been a bit of a different deal for him this year with interceptions, but I think he gives that team the best chance to win. We talked about this last week. You just can't replace a Darius Pickett. Like, you just can't replace a guy like that on defense, a guy who, is, we'll use Mike O'Shea's terms when big plays happen at big moments. This is a guy who's right on time more often than not and is doing something to impact, every game that he plays in. So not having him is obviously a big issue. And, as I mentioned, why I thought why the Saskatchewan Roughriders would be a bit scary here heading into the playoffs is the same reason I don't think the Redblacks will be. And that's that they haven't really established a run game. They got rid of Raquel Armstead, for behavioral reasons and issues. He brought us pretty consistent, if not, fairly dynamic run attack to that team. But, there are things bigger than performance. So, there is that, but they haven't really recovered from that. And I just don't see them as being a huge threat on the ground. And as I mentioned, as is obvious, you need to have that run attack in the playoffs. And so, you combine all those three things and you just, it's just hard to sell this. It's hard to buy into this team and winning, doing much damage in the playoffs, even though they find themselves in a position to, seal a or host a playoff game still. So the one thing, and I'll say this just because I like him and I think Bobby Dice is a guy who can motivate his players. I think he can, game plan with the rest of his coaches and try to find a way. I mean, I will go to the Any Given Sunday. I don't think that they're a team that will just be a pushover, but they need to improve their quarterback play. They need to balance out their attack, and they need to figure out a way to play as well defensively as they have been prior to Darius Pickett getting injured.
Well, and listen, I mean, they are clinched for the playoffs, unlike the Argos, who still theoretically could miss if they lose their final 3 games and Hamilton wins their final 2. But it's highly likely that it's going to be Ottawa and Toronto playing in that semi. And it's going to be, barring the Bombers losing out and Saskatchewan winning out, BC and Saskatchewan in that West final. Location both to be determined. Interested in who you think has the inside track right now at taking a shot at the Alouettes in Montreal. And in the West, I'll kind of go first on this one. To me, if the BC Lions want to come to Winnipeg on November 9th and play in the West final, they have to win this game. I don't like their chances going into Regina, and I certainly don't like their chances making it through Regina and then Winnipeg and getting back to home sweet home for the Grey Cup.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I use these, it's interesting because as you mentioned, the Argos, they still haven't punched their ticket to the playoffs. They could be anywhere, but from second place in the East to not making the playoffs. Now, I don't think that's going to happen. I really don't think I don't think they're going to stumble down the stretch here and allow the Ticats to somehow sneak in. But that being said, you look at these two teams, Huss, and I'm with you on the BC Lions. Like, I just don't think, they're tough enough to play in the outdoor conditions. I think that they have a major disadvantage, unlike any team in the league, just given the mild climate that they live in, essentially year round. It doesn't battle test you for the rigid, freezing conditions on the prairies. So whether that's in Winnipeg, whether that's in Regina, it's going to be a tough thing for them to figure out. And as much as that needs to happen, I don't think it's going to happen unless they can figure out their quarterback play. This is becoming an issue that's really existed since the moment that Nathan Rourke stepped foot back in Vancouver. And while I've been on the side that's been like, yeah, of course you need to start Nathan Rourke. He's he's not only your future, he's your present. There's time for him to gel with the offense to figure these things out. We're now in 3 straight games that the BC Lions have not. Nathan Rourke specifically has not thrown for a touchdown, and they didn't even get an offensive touchdown last week in their beatdown against this, Calgary Stampeders. So this to me is a big issue here, to the point where I'm of the mind that you need to go back to Vernon Adams. I think you need to go back to him. He had the full training camp with the team. He's got the chemistry with the receivers. You know that nobody is going to put up a stink if you go back to Vernon Adams. And it's just getting to a point now that I don't think BC has a sniff with Nathan Rourke. I think they're running out of time. They're running out of leash here to get him going. And I think you could put Vernon Adams in and see a drastic difference in play. The other thing, too, is whether it's a chemistry thing, because we talk a lot about chemistry with the quarterback and receivers. The chemistry amongst the quarterback and the O-line is equally important. And whether it's just BC has a shitty O-line or that chemistry isn't there, something's not working with Nathan Rourke playing in front of those 5 starters. Whereas with Vernon Adams, it was the same O-line, the same, if you will, leaky O-line that's playing in front of Nathan Rourke, but it's his ability to escape the pocket and do crazy things that, few people can do in this league that allowed Vernon Adams in the offense to flourish. So, I know it would be kind of crazy. It certainly would set a fire here, but I don't think that that it's much of an issue to go back to Vernon Adams and still see Nathan Rourke as your future. I think we're headed that way. I've spent a lot of time on the Lions, so I'll throw it over to you on the Argos. Touch the Lions if you want to in the Nathan Rourke situation, but I think the Argos are a team that, while they haven't clinched their playoff spot yet, it's going to happen. Maybe not this week against the Bombers, but eventually will happen. And I think you have the potential for a team like Toronto to do what the Alouettes did to them the year before.
Oh, I've been thinking about that for the last month or so. With the slower start of Toronto, Kelly missing the first half of the season, sort of a pedestrian start. They're rounding into, I think, a much more threatening team, certainly than we saw earlier on this year. And, between Ottawa and Toronto, as much as I love Bobby Dice and the time he spent here in the Peg and the dude that he is, the one thing I'll say about Bobby, I think he went into this season, with a bit of the nobody believes in us to the rest of Ottawa, and I think it brought out the best in them. And then all of a sudden they're 8-3, and they're sniffing around first place. And I don't know whether they believed what the standings were, but I think they've fallen off a little bit. I think he can maybe go back to that messaging that he had to instill in the beginning of the season and hopefully get them turning around. That being said, between the two, I think it's more likely that the Argos will be the team that'll be going to Montreal. And I am very much with you. I will be interested to see how that one goes, because the Argos feel like they owe Montreal one from what happened last year. Chad Kelly is the focal point to that after he almost single-handedly gave that one away. Just quickly on BC, I'm not there. The thought of going back to VA at this point, I kind of think they've made their bed and they're sleeping in it right now. And listen, I'm sure there's an argument to be made that do they have a better chance to win? Like Nathan Rourke last week, he didn't throw a touchdown. He only went for 218 yards, but he was 20 of 24, and he didn't make the mistakes that would have cost them the game. And the bottom line is they went out and they won running away with it at the end. A lot of that has to do with just where Calgary's at right now. But to make that sort of a move, I do wonder what that does to Rourke's position moving forward as the starting quarterback, which he undoubtedly will be next year. If anything, mid-game. The other thing about VA is that the last time we saw him, it hasn't been very good. Going in for Rourke at that one point, and then before that, of course, being at the helm of the shutout at the hands of the Bombers. That's a long time ago, and to expect them just to rekindle that magic. Listen, they are blessed with 2 good options, and if things aren't going well with their season on the line, they can go that way. But I would be stunned if it's anyone other than Nathan Rourke as the guy that's getting the call from Rick Campbell. We can't forget about the Ticats, and I'll preface this. I'll preface this before I officially say we're writing them off, because I did that at the end of last week's game. The scenario for the Ticats is as follows. They'll be big Bomber fans on Friday, hoping that Winnipeg clinches the West and beats Toronto. And then both teams would have 2 games left. The Argos hosting the Ottawa Redblacks, while Hamilton hosts Calgary. And if Ottawa and Hamilton were to win, it would come down to week 21 with Hamilton in Ottawa and Toronto in Edmonton. So still technically alive, highly unlikely we'll even get to that final weekend with this meeting everything. What to take away from the Ticats? I mean, they had that terrible start. They really were playing some good football. And much like the Elks, were victims of those terrible first 7-8 games of the season as to why they're not in the mix right now. Bo Levi put up some big numbers, seemed to click with Milanovic as the season went on, despite getting stifled by the Bombers last week. I'm really intrigued as to where Hamilton goes from here, because I think they're a better team than their record shows, and I do think there's a lot of potential in that room. And I don't think Bo's done either.
Yeah, so there's a lot there. But I think, much like the Elks and McLeod Bethel Thompson talking about the team being cursed and having close games and not finding themselves on the right side of things, and certainly that was the case in Hamilton. You heard some of that narrative come out during their 4-game win streak about how things weren't happening early on. And, of course, well documented the drop balls and Tim White putting the thing on a platter for Saskatchewan beforehand and yada, yada, yada. That's all loser talk, man. Like, that's talk for losers. Like, if you're talking about how you narrowly miss the playoffs in a league where 2/3 of the teams make the playoffs, 6 out of 9 teams, you're talking like a loser. And so, much like the situation in Edmonton, Hamilton's going to have to figure out if what they saw in the 4-game win streak that had them the talk of the CFL was a team that was truly rounding into form, or if it was just simply a club that was so desperate for wins that if they didn't win, they'd be eliminated from the playoffs. The Ticats have been playing playoff football for 6 weeks now. And so, is this really a team that you think is just going to start, hot next season again when they and are going to right the ship? Potentially, I'm not in there, the one dissecting.
Well, you don't need to start hot. You just need to not tank your entire season in the first half of it.
Well, again, you're going to have to look at it and see if, again, I'm not, I'm not the guy, I'm not Scott Milanovic that is dissecting to degrees that, every degree into every week on why you lost. You have you're going to be back next season. Whether Chris Jones will be back as your defensive coordinator, I think he's done some good things there. I mean, the Bombers fed him his lunch and he dared them to run and they shoved it down his throat, but he's done some great things in Hamilton. Maybe that is the start of something good and reevaluating everything. It was interesting. I had a great conversation with Bo Levi Mitchell while I was in Hamilton. I wanted to talk about his relationship with Scott Milanovic. I talked on this show months ago about how I'd never seen a head coach rip into his number 1 quarterback like I saw Milanovic rip into Bo Levi Mitchell after throwing, one of his league-leading interceptions. But that seems to be okay. That's been repaired, if you will. I don't know if repair is fair. Certainly it required a repairing over the offseason, and Bo told me it was that conversation with Scott during the offseason, realizing just how similar they are as people and in the process and desiring to win. But where is Scott Milanovic going to feel like Bo Levi Mitchell is at the end of this season? We talk about him being a potential MOP guy, and that's true given what he's had to do. But while I don't buy into the garbage time narrative for all of Bo Levi's Mitchell's yards, I do think they were comeback kids for a lot of the season. So while it wasn't garbage yards, I think defenses changed the way in which they were defending the Ticats and ensuring that they weren't blowing the top off their defense, which resulted in more yards. So I just, much like much like we see the pace of the game with the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. Zach Collaros had way more interceptions in the first 8 games compared to this last 8-game winning streak because the feel of the games are different. He doesn't have to test the ball down field because they're trailing in games. They can lean on the run game. So Hamilton needs to figure out what exactly is going down there. They need to figure out their quarterback situation, because you got to remember, before Bo Levi Mitchell got his second opportunity, and marched his way into the MOP conversation, Taylor Powell was deemed the guy and was playing pretty good football before getting hurt. And the football I'm talking about is coming in for that game against the Alouettes early on, where Bo got pulled and threw for more than 300 yards. He only lasted like 4 plays after that before he got a concussion. So he's a 26-year-old that's still waiting in the wings. And I think if they do go with the same quarterback room, if Bo Levi Mitchell does return to the Ticats, I don't see it as the starting quarterback. I see it as a guy who will mentor and be a safety net for Taylor Powell. Whether Bo Levi Mitchell will be interested in doing that is another situation. I think that was one of the biggest takeaways from my conversation with him, is that he felt his recent play has got him into has put him in a position where he doesn't have to beg and plead for an opportunity for a comeback. So he thinks his opportunities will be there. He wants to stay in Hamilton, but whether or not that opportunity goes to him or Taylor Powell is a big and one of many questions for the Hamilton Tiger Cats as they enter the offseason.
I guess the one Ticat that we might be talking about going down the stretch is still Bo Levi Mitchell, because he has been a guy that, with the numbers that he's put up, would normally be considered for the most outstanding player in the league. I think he's up against it right now, despite the gaudy numbers, because to your point, when 2/3 of the teams don't make the playoffs and you're not in the playoffs as a quarterback, it's about winning games. And it doesn't matter if you throw for 500 yards. If you're throwing a few picks that go the other way and you lose, it does take away. To me, recency bias is also a big thing. What you do in the second half is often a lot more impactful than what you do in the first half. And that's why I think we've got a new favorite to be the MOP in Brady Oliveira. I said in the last couple of weeks, it's still stunning to me that we were able to get Brady Oliveira at 14-1 to in the MOP just like 16 days ago. He was still at Coolbet, the second favorite behind Cody Fajardo going into last week's action. But I did see on TSN they were flashing a number that had Brady at -140 before he had 147 yards on 24 carries last week. The resurgence of the Bombers, led by Brady Oliveira, I think makes him almost a lock to be the Western nominee. And I think the Alouettes' record kind of makes Cody Fajardo close to a lock to be the Eastern guy. But I will say this, if you're asking me for a favorite right now, I think a lot of what Cody did at the start of the year before he went out, it might get him the nominee. I'm not sure that he gets the actual vote for it. I think as we sit here today, heading into the final few weeks of the regular season, in a stunning turnaround, Brady Oliveira is in fact the favorite and most likely MOP for the CFL in 2024.
Yeah, maybe it wasn't quite undisputed last week. I feel like we're in that territory now. And that's no disrespect to, Roland Milligan in Saskatchewan.
Milligan and Harris are the two other guys that I think, are worthy of a conversation.
Even Tyrell Ford, I have time for. The way he's graded out with Pro Football Focus, week to week. Obviously, he's one short of Milligan for the league lead in interceptions. I think Milligan has a certain edge playing special teams. And I don't know if he's still leading the league in special teams, but he was at one point, like deep into the season. Leading
I'm pretty sure he's still the leading
category.
Special teams
So that's a guy willing to put his body on the line and then play exceptionally well on the defensive side of the game. So I certainly have time for it. But when you just look at what Brady Oliveira has done, over the entire season. I don't have much time for the early hiccups, because it wasn't like previous years where we're talking to him in week 5, 6, 7. It's like, where is that Brady? That was a couple years ago. That was the beginning of even last year. He got injured the first game, which forced him to miss the second game. But really, he's been consistent ever since. He, took a little bit to get going after returning from that injury. But by week 4 or 5, I mean, the guy's averaging 100 yards from scrimmage a game. And you look at what he was able to do this past week against Hamilton, against a good defensive front and for the Tiger Cats, and to have a season high 147 yards on the ground and 24 carries. I mean, that's a guy who's putting his team on his back, and that's nothing. You certainly cannot talk about his accolades and not talk about the Bombers O-line and what they've done over the last 6 weeks in particular here. They've returned to being the heart and soul of this team, or at least matching what the defense is doing. So that certainly has played a role, and that also goes for the receivers blocking on the edges and helping open those holes and lanes for Brady. But this is just a guy who is pretty close and I wouldn't say unreachable to 2,000 yards from scrimmage. He needs 322 in the last 2 games. He could very well get it if the Bombers have to play that final game for something in Montreal in the final regular season game, but he is going to count this Friday. I imagine he's going to have a big game, whether that's through the air or on the ground. He wants to avenge his dismal performance against the Argos back in week 8 when he kind of he did get the turnover party started with the first fumble, with just minutes into the first quarter. He hasn't, he's had to watch that tape all week long.
The turnover party. That's exactly what that game was.
Yeah, and they had to watch that tape all week long. So you're going to get a motivated guy. Here's the question I have, Huss, is okay, so say Brady runs for 100 yards, maybe averages, maybe runs for whatever. What does Roland Milligan need to do, or Tyrell Ford need to do, or Cody Fajardo? Because I'm with you. Cody Fajardo, I believe, is 1-3 in his last 4 starts, or no, maybe not quite that. It might be Drew Brown, but they've lost games in a row. They've only have 1 win in their last 4 games. These games don't mean anything. So what? The last third of the season is going to be uneventful for Cody Fajardo and the Alouettes?
That was Chad Kelly last year.
Yeah.
I mean, the
on a
Argos
16-2 win team, though.
Well, for
and he
sure,
had
and they're
better
not going to have
numbers than
that
Cody
record.
Fajardo. They weren't great. They were in and around similar spaces when you compare them to other quarterbacks. But this is what, this might sound a little offside and whatever, but I think Brady wins it unless he tests positive for steroids in the last 2 weeks. I just don't see him missing out on the MOP race. And
that better not happen. They need that guy.
Just to be clear, that would never happen to him. He's, about as clean as a guy as it gets in this league. But that seems to be the only thing that can really...
Unless he gets suspended for rescuing dogs, I think Brady's going to be just fine moving forward.
Exactly.
It has been an amazing turnaround. And listen, the one knock on Oliveira that I heard from a lot of people, yourself included, was, well, he didn't have any touchdowns. Listen, when you have Chris Streveler on your team and you know how much of a beating the running backs take, and you've got a guy like Chris Streveler that is basically guaranteed to get the yards, early on in the season, I think it made a ton of sense to take that load off a little bit and let Strev bring it in. I'm sure it was frustrating for Brady. The touchdowns have come, and the way he's playing right now, credit to the offensive line and everyone else that has a piece of it. But this dude is getting going, and it's taking 2 and 3 and 4 guys to bring him down. And he's showing a creativity, of vision with some of his moves that he's turning 5-yard gains into 17 and 20-yard gains. And has really been offensively, I would say, the catalyst to the turnaround. Although, as I said before, it started with the Blue Bomber defense. And now, most importantly, big picture, when we're talking Grey Cup, Zach Collaros is looking like the Zach Collaros of the last number of years. And that's a guy that certainly has maybe something to prove come the big game, if, of course, the Bombers can get it. Hammer, listen, before we go, a quick look over at the Cool Bet lines for this weekend's games. Still a lot to play for right now. Friday night here in Winnipeg, sold out Princess Auto Stadium. 1.5-point favorites against the Toronto Argonauts. Bombers minus 200 on the money line. 2 really tight games. I mean, the Edmonton-Calgary game, it's the Provincial Pride Bowl in Ottawa. Calgary's a 1-point favorite in that one. And I've just seen a little bit of movement here. Saskatchewan was a 1-point favorite earlier. I'm seeing 1.5 now. But this BC Saskatchewan game, so much to play for, although they'll both be in the playoffs. Saskatchewan a -122 favorite, and then Montreal -4.5 favorite against the Ottawa Redblacks. But I mean, the game that stands out to me the most, outside of everyone in Winnipeg hoping and looking forward to Friday to see if the Bombers can clinch that West Final here, is this BC Sask game, which is going to go on Saturday, 6 p.m. Central Time, 7 in the East. There is a lot on the line. We've talked a lot about Saskatchewan, a lot about BC. In all likelihood, this will not be the last time these two teams meet, but will have everything to do with deciding where these two teams meet, which is going to be a big, big factor come Western playoff time.
Yeah, that's definitely the one I'm looking forward to. As you mentioned, I think there's obviously a lot on the line for both teams in the Toronto and Winnipeg game, so that one's going to be a great game to start off the weekend. But I mean, the other one, like you said, there's still technically a possibility that the Riders could leapfrog the Bombers for first place, but in all likelihood, that will be a rematch or we'll see a rematch of that game in the Western semifinal, and the winner likely to be the one that hosts that game. It's going to be, it's a good weekend of ball. Even that Calgary and Edmonton game, those are two pissed off teams that are going to be taking it out on each other. And I believe Matthew Schultz is getting the start in Calgary, so maybe there's an opportunity for him to figure that out. Trey Ford's getting the opportunity to start in Edmonton, so you get to see those guys perform, potentially be auditioning for next season. If
you're wondering, Alouette still the Grey Cup favorite at Coolbet, +175. Bombers right behind him at 2-1. BC +450. Argos +750. Riders 11-1. Redblacks 12-1. And the Ticats still on the board, at least hanging by a prayer to even be a part of the postseason. Thanks again to our great sponsors, Garage Living Winnipeg, for their support of CFL 110. Check out their website, garageliving.com, for the amazing work that they can do for you and your home and garage. And if you're in Manitoba or Saskatchewan, give Pat Canoe a call, 204-999-1234, to arrange a free in-garage consultation, and they'll let you know what's possible with your space. Hammer, great stuff as always. Cannot wait to get to playoff time and take CFL 110 out to Vancouver for Grey Cup week. Enjoy the games this week, and we'll do it again next time.
Looking forward to, my friend.
Have a great weekend, everyone. Enjoy the 3-down game starting on Friday here in Winnipeg.
You've been listening to CFL 110. Tune in next week for more great Canadian football discussion.